If you're on this channel, I would bet that you love fantasy or are at least interested in it, and that's probably why you're here right now. If you don't or you aren't, then I'm glad you're here for me to make an attempt at changing your mind. Fantasy is a massive genre so broad in all the things that it encompasses that it almost fails to be descriptive as a term. But one thing that we can all generally agree on is that fantasy is the realm of narratives where things that would be normally impossible are made possible through means beyond the conventional. Unlike sci-fi, in which speculative advances in very real fields tend to inform the beyond our reality experiences we encounter, fantasy spans almost every other explanation for that which is beyond the mundane. Game of Thrones is fantasy, as is The Legend of Zelda, as is Dark Souls and Warhammer, all of its flavors, and the Elder Scrolls and Lord of the Rings and the Wheel of Time, and even those old myths medieval villagers would tell their children to scare them into not wandering off into the woods at night. All of these and hundreds more are fantasy, and if you ask someone who loves fantasy why they love the genre, it may take them a second to actually offer you an explanation. Maybe giving a "because it's cool," "because I like magic," or "because dragons are pretty sick." And these, of course, are all fair answers, but there's so much beyond that and so much history to this genre that warrants discussion, and these are all things that most fans of the genre believe or agree with, even if they probably wouldn't quite explain it to you were you to ask them. For as much as some have the impression that fantasy is the realm of contrived magic systems and samey village farm boy kills dark lord stories, it has a great literary and even philosophical background that we'll dip into a little bit just to introduce us to the topic with Part 1, The Origins of Modern Fantasy. From a certain point of view, fantasy has always existed. Just as those old folk tales are fantasy, so too are epics like Gilgamesh or the Odyssey. In some ways, fantasy is quite literally our oldest genre of fiction. And in a way, that segues into exactly why it has remained so popular, even as it has drastically changed, particularly over the last few centuries. But one foundational difference between the fantasy of antiquity and the fantasy of today is, in some ways, amusingly, plausibility. I'm not someone who would argue, in fact, I vehemently hate the argument that people of the past were stupid and didn't understand anything about the world, and so they thought all fantasy stories were true. We have plenty of proof and reason to believe these sorts of stories were fictional to them just as they are to us. However, in pre-modern times, before the scientific revolution, easy communication across long distances, and even considering just the difficulty of actually storing information, just take some time reading about how difficult it was to actually get parchment and ink back in antiquity. Not to mention how hard it is to keep those things from deteriorating over long spans of time. I digress. Due to those kinds of factors, even with these fantastic stories, there would have remained the idea in the popular consciousness of their time that some of these mythical creatures are, or at least could be, real. Or maybe that they were real for sure, but just some long time ago or in some place that's really far away. These fantasy stories in part benefited from and utilized the idea that their elements could maybe be founded in reality, just a reality most didn't have the opportunity to personally experience. The reason I introduced that is because this perspective on what a fantasy story means to people kind of changed around the 18th and 19th centuries, around the time of the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, and rationalism. These ideas, which to us today are so thoroughly ingrained that thinking outside of them is almost alien to many people, revolutionized the ways in which we just viewed the world and the things in it. No longer were folk tales about fairies enough to put even a little stock into such stories. Now one needed proof, documentation, and so on, and so lots of these fantasy stories lost that maybe somewhere kind of credibility. And of course, these changes in thinking alongside the rapid development of technology around those times meant that we understood the world better than ever before. Entire new methodologies for categorizing information were developed, from the modern conception of what a species is to our understanding of the elements of the periodic table. Many of the world's mysteries, those previously thought unknowable things, were finally within the grasp of our comprehension, and those comprehensions could be tested and backed up in ways that weren't possible before. And for all that that gained us, we actually did lose a few things in the process. For while in the world of the material we knew so much more than ever before, With it came, in some sense, a loss of the magic in the world. In some ways, this was obviously beneficial, as much as I'd argue for the wisdom of pre-modern people beyond what credit we normally give them. They were obviously just wrong about a great number of things. Certain things, like the degree to which people thought the world was flat back then, tend to be overstated, but obviously without these sorts of developments, we wouldn't understand things as seemingly basic to us now as germ theory. But still, the newly industrialized world was not actually all that pleasant to live in it for a lot of people. The rise of factories and urbanization created all the countless drudgeries and misery you likely do, or maybe should, associate with the Industrial Revolution and that general era in history. Urban populations meant significant urban poverty, long shifts with little protections for things like even basic safety and that sort of thing. And all this, alongside the destruction of the world's final mysteries and even hatred for those mysteries which remained, as opposed to the wonder or fear that such things once imposed. It's in this environment that what I think of as modern fantasy's grandfather was born: Romanticism. Much as modernism and naturalism in narrative fiction and the rising literate novel-reading culture were emblematic of Enlightenment ideals, Romanticism was a reaction to that. Like almost any 19th century idea, it definitely had its pitfalls, as the Germans seemed to like romantic ideals about their ancient past and applying them to their nation, perhaps a little too much. But at its core, Romanticism celebrated human emotion and experience in a way that more rationalist conceptions of the time tried to destroy, or at the very least downplay. This conflict would see the creation of modern fantasy in part through the Industrial Revolution's arguably most impactful, and certainly most infamous product, industrial mechanized warfare. The First World War, to simplify, was a pressure cooker for the ideas that had guided the industrialized world for the past several decades. All of the enthusiasm and optimism for scientific advancement, for a rational humanity that would never possibly ever use this advanced technology for destructive purposes, turned out to be ever so slightly lacking in wisdom, and somewhere around 20 million deaths later, those who survived started to question why exactly we waltzed into a future full of machine guns, trenches, and barbed wire. After experiencing 4 years of bloody, muddy, shrapnel-filled hell, who could blame someone for looking back fondly on a time before such things were even possible? How much good did the invention of the combustion engine do for someone blown up by a tank? It was out of this milieu and the surviving influence of Romanticism that our contemporary 20th century fantasy founding fathers, kind of accidental alliteration there, got their start, but we'll focus on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Tolkien more straightforwardly grew out of Romanticism. He wrote his protagonists to come from the Shire, an idyllic pastoral landscape. His heroes were fundamentally good, peaceful, and friendly. The nature that surrounded their living spaces was itself a sign of that place's inherent goodness. These are all concepts very emblematic of Romanticism. And following this, it's no surprise that Mordor would be a place of choking ash and volcanoes, for there really is no better natural equivalent aesthetics-wise to a factory belching filth into the air. It's fairly clear reading Tolkien that his experience in World War I created a desire in him to build a world that was as far from that as possible, that would resist the coming of anything comparable to it with heroic defiance. With C.S. Lewis, we get into, in part, some theological territory I may spare you for the sake of this video's duration, but he too was influenced by Romanticism. He wasn't a romantic, which is important to note. You can read his critiques on it, but generally he agreed with their foundations. In particular, however, I want to draw you to a concept he brought into our conception in the English language: Sehnsucht. In his definition, it was a fundamental longing for experience beyond the mundane, for a spiritual connection that cannot be satisfied by the material world. But before we elaborate on that, we'll move on to part 2, longing in modernity. Sehnsucht is the backbone of fantasy, even to those who have never heard the word before, for pretty much everybody who writes within this genre with intent. My personal theory for the modern prevalence of fantasy almost entirely rests upon this concept. Working off the above definition, that longing for something beyond the mundane, we fairly neatly work our way into concepts of escapism, and our desire for it, especially in the modern world. While escapism in general is to some degree one of the fundamental ways in which people just engage with fiction, Even things like Hallmark movies are escapist in the sense of, I wish my love life was as dramatic and successful as the 40th Hallmark character this actress has played. But when we're talking about genres that take us a lot further away from our everyday reality, we get a different sense of escapism. Arguing that modernity, however you choose to define it or what you consider to fall under that umbrella, is wholesale worse than everything that came before it would be pretty foolish. Modern medicine is pretty cool. Average lifespans in the 70s and 80s as opposed to the 50s are also, I think, probably a good thing. However, there are fair arguments that humanity's journey to getting here resulted in plenty of things being lost. The medieval farmer may not have had much impact on the world in a large-scale sense, but what impact they did have, they saw. Through the feeding of their family, through watching plants grow out of the earth, and through selling or giving them away, the effects of their life's toil were in some way very tangible. One can argue for a great many modern careers, especially the sort of archetypical Western white-collar worker satirized in movies like Office Space, that our ability to influence the world around us, to feel like we've left an impact, has been reduced or at least changed. Combine that with the Tolkien-esque desire for a world that had more colors than gray in the surrounding vicinity and a wish for a return to nature, and you get the motive that backs a fair portion of the pull of fantasy settings for people. It's no coincidence, at least not to me, that one of the core ways fantasy spread into common consciousness was through role-playing games and later video games, in which you quite literally take on the role of someone who lives in a world unlike our own, whose concerns lay in the orcish army on the other side of the mountain, or the treasure hoard that may lie in a forgotten crypt. For all that someone might say, it's not that deep, bro, there's always an underlying reason for this sort of thing. There's a reason we crave something that feels substantively different from our everyday experience. It's why the most common format of tabletop RPG isn't about playing as an office worker who works for Verizon instead of the players AT&T that they work at in real life. But now that I say that, a sort of office life satire tabletop RPG could potentially be fun, but particularly because of the satire and the subversion, but I digress. Naturally, there remains space for all sorts of other artistic expressions. As much as I may enjoy making fun of Hallmark movies, and as unlikely to watch one as I might be, they too have their valid reasons to exist. But as our topic is fantasy, I simply wish to focus on the idea that it is the genre that I think most succinctly succeeds in pulling people out of their normal headspace. It's also why I've always detested the catch-all term of sci-fi fantasy, and try not to use it at this point at all. Sci-fi fantasy as a catch-all means very little because sci-fi and fantasy tend to exist for entirely different reasons, with extreme thematic differences. All they have in common inherently is that things not currently possible in real life happen sometimes. And if that's supposedly sufficient to describe a genre, I suppose it's then fair to start making generalizations about the genre of a romance action comedy drama, because more often than not they take place in a contemporary setting, which I guess is good enough to lump them together. Before I crash out entirely, we can move on to the next point. Part 3, how fantasy is most effective. As I've been laying out, fantasy is at its most effective when it takes advantage of the fact that it allows for the impossible. While sci-fi, itself a very interesting subcategory of storytelling, I, like fantasy, think it shouldn't even necessarily be called a genre because Blade Runner and Spaceballs are not the same genre of story, but they are both sci-fi. Sci-fi is obviously still a useful categorization, it's just not a genre in of itself, that's all I'm saying. However, allowing for the impossible can mean a lot of different things, and the problems in fantasy storytelling, as I've said in about a million other videos at this point, is when that allowance is taken too far, and writers don't take care to maintain internal consistency, which will kill essentially every story, regardless of what genre it is. Instead, fantasy is at its most effective when it exists in opposition to something in reality. Naturally, all great works are products of their time, influenced by the circumstances in which they were written. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings in part because of his experiences in the First World War, but one needn't go through a war to have things to comment on. And here, of course, is where fantasy's greatest advantage comes in, especially when working in a fantasy world entirely distinct from Earth, though you can still pull it off in urban fantasy and all that, don't feel limited. You're given the license to do whatever you want to the context of your story. You can emphasize aspects of your world related to that which you intend to center your story on. If your narrative is more political, you can set up an entire political zeitgeist. Write political parties and motives and show the ways in which a system does or does not work. You can fundamentally build a world around that concept. Doing such things introduces extra elements that particularly make good fantasy hard to write. The further away you pull from reality, the more of those differences you have to gracefully confer upon your audience without dumping a bucket load of lore onto them. But once you have that context established, you have a story in which all the boundaries are controlled by yours truly. It is the case when writing in more contemporary settings further outside of fantasy, you need to bear in mind the reality of that setting. Things that are distinctly different from reality need to be justified in those stories by things like alternative history or by setting things slightly in the future. And even then, some of those futures are more or less believable than others. That doesn't always negatively impact their quality, but it can. Stories like The Man in the High Castle or even 1984 are either dubious or fairly vague about how their worlds came to be, either because they'd be extremely unlikely, as in Man in the High Castle, because the Nazis ever winning World War II that hard was never going to happen. They were not nearly competent enough to do anything like that. And in 1984, the explanation for why that world is the way it is remains vague, not only because it's hard to imagine how things could get to such an absurd degree of terrible, but also because from the point of view the novel is told from, our protagonist would have no way of actually knowing how this all came to be. I went on that side tangent essentially just to say that you don't have that kind of situation when writing fantasy. You don't need to justify departures from reality because you aren't in something necessarily meant to resemble reality. That doesn't make it better, just different. In some ways easier to create, in other ways more difficult. And we can now move to our final part, which is, in summary, much of the entire point of the video. And that's part 4. Make use of the genre. Your challenge next becomes to make those ways in which you do depart from reality, the reasons for which you wrote a fantasy story and not within some other category, meaningful. If your only reason for writing in fantasy is because you can have dragons and magic, that might make it a bit more fun, maybe a little cooler, but you'd be missing a lot of opportunity. Thankfully, fantasy stories and their infamously long page counts do leave you some room to do things just because they're fun or whatever, or because you can. But I really want to emphasize more than anything with the video that fantasy exists for good reasons, for meaningful reasons. And if you ever want to make fantasy that is great, you should be taking advantage of those reasons. Make a comment on its origins with your world. Make a comment on the genre's origins with your world, whether continuing in the tradition informed by that Zen-sukt concept, creating a world of natural beauty, tormented by the choking smog of evil, or even should you wish to subvert that, at least doing something with those ideas will signal to the audience that your world is well considered. At the end of the day, the quality of a fantasy work is not determined by how deep its magic system is, how many totally unique non-human species you develop, or just how many fictional countries you can write the complex histories of. It's by how you use those things to distinctly, purposefully shape a story in which you can clearly convey a message in which every aspect of it is at your whim. So much can be made of even minor details about your world. What does it mean for one faction to use firearms and another one to not? If magic is corrosive to those who use it, what does it mean to be someone who will wield it anyway? Why would they do so? For short-term gain, for the defense of their homeland, to slay a great evil? These are the kinds of questions you should be asking when you come up with these concepts. Fantasy is, or at least probably should be, explorative, yet every genre has its tropes, its common themes, and what have you, and these aren't bad things. Tropes get a bad rap, but they're actually useful for making identifiable story elements. Realistically, tropes are so well documented that almost any story element is a trope of some sort. Yes, even that incredibly unique one we all have, that we're sure nobody else has ever done yet, and yet probably does actually have an entry on tvtropes.com. That all being the case, fantasy should not fear tropes, yet some of them are very strongly ingrained. I talked about that a lot in my The D&Dification of Fantasy video, which for all I know just stems out of my irate frustration at every tabletop RPG being generically referred to as D&D, but that's probably just me tweaking, as are most of the things I say here really, but what can you do? People come to the genre expecting elves and dwarves and orcs. You can choose to give them to people or to not give them to people. They expect wizards and magic and kings. They expect medieval stagnancy on an aesthetic level. To those who don't really pay much attention to the genre of fantasy, you can mash all those concepts together into one big pot, and out would come the aggregate expectation of what most people think fantasy is. And all I've been saying up to this point is just to lead you in the direction that, one, not all fantasy has to be like that, and two, if you're making your own fantasy, it's crucially important, I think, to recognize how far beyond those tropes you can really go, or how far you can go in adapting them even if you still want to use them. There's nothing about the genre of fantasy that inherently dictates the presence of any of those particular tropes. Yet they're established enough that should you want to use them, you actually do benefit from the groundwork of what they are already being established in the audience's mind. Should you want to do something new with elves, for example, you do benefit from not having to explain elves quite as much as you'd have to explain some entirely new species, in the same way a writer of contemporary fiction doesn't have to explain what France is. Both France and the concept of elves are likely to exist, however unfortunate that may be in the prior case, in the audience's mind. So while the work then shifts to differentiating your elves from those of other contemporary fantasy, it does save you some time. You shouldn't fear the archetypical in your fantasy stories, but investigate why you're compelled to cling to those tropes, as shorthand to get across that it's a fantasy world just because you like them, or because you have a real purpose for them within the narrative in your world. And just the same, if you decide to go very speculative, try your damnedest to avoid all the tropes people associate with fantasy, then investigate why you're doing that. While on the face of it, it might seem a superior approach to going tropey, are you making use of these departures or only achieving a slightly different aesthetic? Just because something departs from the conventional doesn't make it good. You might depart from standard fantasy fare by replacing your heroic farm boy protagonist with a debaucherous conqueror with a bloody past just now trying to turn his life around. A concept that may be interesting, but the concept alone cannot carry you through to a compelling finish if it turns out that you write that character to be completely intolerable. And here I can close out the video and also address an issue with fantasy that I don't see addressed very often, at least not so directly. We've been talking fantasy ideas all video, and it's in those ideas that the genre can both exceed others and also have its downfall. Often we talk about people who world build infinitely and never write despite that actually being their original intention. Or those who develop complex and brilliantly thought out magic systems but can't write a character interaction to save their life. Fantasy is the place for ideas like those, for breaching past reality as we've been talking about. It's about hearkening back to other times and places in history and achieving feelings that you just can't get in other genres. And yet you can't, of course, ignore the fundamentals of actual narrative writing. That's why I'll finally stop rambling and give you this simple statement. If you don't read or write fantasy, give the genre a try. There's a lot more to it than you might have originally thought, and it can show you things you'd never see in other genres. And on the other side of the coin, if you're a fanatic for fantasy to such a point it's most of what you consume, branch out, especially if you're a writer. Because only that way, through getting new influences outside the fantasy zeitgeist, can you bring new things into it. But all that said, that's enough for today and another extremely rambly JBat video, but hopefully at least some of that made sense or was at least mildly interesting. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to hang around, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it. As we close out, I'd like to thank those glorious patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sonny, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don Sadico, and Cavalier of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jody on Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, your word of the day is Zensucht.